Hey everybody, on this episode of the show, I got a listener question asking for more information about depression. And so I use that as a prompt to do a deep dive into the topic. We go through basically everything you need to know from start to finish. We talk about what is depression, the criteria for it. We talk about some case studies, misconceptions about depression, treatment options, medical things that could look like depression. It's a very comprehensive episode and a great starting place for anybody who wants to learn more about depression. Or if you're somebody that does struggle with depression, this would be a great one to send to people that can help them understand more about what you're going through. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff. I'm a clinical psychologist and a self-help author from Southern California. My goal is to make mental health content for real people, just like you. And in this show, I answer your questions or dive deep into topics related to life, psychology, mental health, relationships, and more. Please be aware that sometimes I use some spicy language, and I also don't shy away from sensitive topics, but I will try to give you a content warning whenever it's relevant. So if all this sounds good to you, let's get started. All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. Thank you for joining me. This is episode 384. And today I have a listener question, and I'm going to be using that as a prompt to dive deep and talk all about depression. Before that, I wanted to say thank you. I took a week off the podcast last week. I had written up something. It was just sort of a spur of the moment thing. I was going to be talking about a different topic, which is asking permission. So kind of the power of asking permission in different contexts. So I do have that kind of mini episode in my back pocket. But last week, I just wasn't feeling up to it. And it worked out that I had the opportunity to take a week off. And, you know, whenever that's the case, I try to give myself that grace because, it's a lot of prep to go into this podcast sometimes. So I hope you don't mind the incontinuity, but I'm back and I'm ready to go. I just ate a bowl of frosted mini wheats at 9 o'clock at night. So I have some extra energy to get through this episode. But wherever you are, I hope that you are taking really good care of yourself. If you have a question or a topic suggestion for the podcast, please send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com or go to my website, duffthepsych.com, and use the contact form there. You can write in a question or you can even record a question for the show. Either one is totally okay. And yeah, let's go ahead and just jump into it. Here's the question that prompted this episode. It reads, "Hi there. Thankful for your podcast. I'm trying to find a few that are specifically on depression, even super basic, to share with my boyfriend who is curious about what he's feeling and learning more. Can you help guide me to a few of your episodes you suggest to start with on that topic?" So really great question. I do have some previous podcast episodes. Be sure to use the search bar on my website if you're looking for stuff like that. But I think I can do one better here. So let's go ahead and just do an entire episode just devoted to the topic. So to the person who asked a question, first off, thank you for trying to find resources for your boyfriend. I think that's awesome. I commonly suggest that people find resources to point their partners toward to help them understand either their own or their partner's mental health issues. But sometimes I know it can be hard to find resources that are a good starting point, resources that are, well-informed, comprehensive, not just quick TikToks and things like that. So this is for you and your boyfriend who are hoping to learn more about his experience. I appreciate both of you and your willingness to learn. So starting at the beginning, what is depression? I think one simple way to think about depression is to consider the actual word itself. Other situations where in English you would use the word depression. Right? So outside of mental health, think about what that means. If you are experiencing respiratory depression, that means that you're having trouble breathing. If you depress a button, that means that you are pushing it down. The Great Depression, a lot of us are familiar with that, right? It refers to an intense period of a financial slump. A depression on a surface, like a walkway or something like that. A depression on surface means there's a hollow or sunken in place. And the actual etymology, so the root of the word depression, traces all the way back to the Latin word deprimere. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly because I don't speak Latin, but that means to press down. So when you apply that to your mood, basically it means that your mood is being pressed down, which is very much what, our depression sounds like. Now, as with most mental health issues, the word depression can be used to describe a type of feeling like, oh man, that movie was so depressing, or I'm just feeling kind of depressed this week. And it also can mean a specific mental health disorder. So technically speaking, when we're talking about disorders, there are several different types of depressive disorders that are categorized in the DSM. There are different sort of medical texts that we use to categorize disorders. The DSM, which is now in its 5th edition revised, is the one that psychologists and therapists tend to use. And in that, they basically describe different flavors of depression. And these include things like major depressive disorder, which we'll mainly talk about here, but also things like persistent depressive disorder, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is PMDD, and other ones as well. So definitely, if you're ever curious, you can have a look online at some of those criteria. But, rather than talking in the abstract about the features of depression, let's actually go through the DSM criteria for major depression. So I'm going to read through them, and these are somewhat summarized. I took out, some of the language that doesn't need to be in there for this context, so it's not verbatim, but this is the gist of it, and I'm going to go through all the criteria and then make a few comments afterward. So for major depression or major depressive disorder, you need 5 or more of these following criteria to be present during the same 2-week period, and it has to represent a change from previous functioning. Now, importantly, at least one of the symptoms has to be either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure from activities. So what are the criteria? First one, depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. And this can be indicated by your own internal subjective report of feeling sad, hopeless, empty, etc., or by observations made from others. The next one is markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities. Again, most of the day, nearly every day. So really, really not interested in things that would be pleasurable or any activities, really. The next one is significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain. And this could also apply to appetite, so an increase or a decrease in appetite. So some sort of significant fluctuation there. Insomnia, which is trouble falling asleep, or hypersomnia, meaning oversleeping nearly every day. Psychomotor agitation or retardation, meaning speeding up or slowing down. So having like really kind of frantic, agitated movements or very slow movements, almost kind of vegetative. Again, nearly every day. And this is not one that is really judged based on subjective feelings, but what people see from the outside, so observed by others. Next is fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Pretty straightforward there. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day. Diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day. And then the last one is recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicidal ideation, or a specific plan or attempt to die by suicide. Now, those are the criteria. There's a few other things here that it lists. So one is that these symptoms need to cause, clinically significant distress, meaning just a lot of subjective distress. It's really, really hard for you to deal with, or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So they need to impact your life. The episode can't be attributable to, the physiological effects of a substance or to another medical condition. So there are certainly other things that can mimic this. We'll talk a little bit about that, but that wouldn't count as major depressive disorder if there's a different reason for it. Again, the major depressive episode is not better explained by another psychological disorder. And I would add to that, a different neurotype or neurodevelopmental disorder. For instance, people who are, autistic may have a lot of symptoms. Symptoms may even be the wrong word. There are ways that they don't fit well with the world that neurotypical people live in that may kind of present as depression, but it wouldn't exactly fit the frame of that very well because it's better explained by the fact that they have autism. So you need to be careful about that. And then the last one is that the person can't ever have had a manic episode or a hypomanic episode, except for when that's due to a substance, right? Like taking an upper and having a manic episode, that doesn't count. But if you have a manic episode or hypomanic episode, then we're looking at bipolar disorder. So that was a mouthful and that was a lot, right? This is kind of how we actually look at these things in the field. So those were all of the technical criteria for major depression. A few things to point out here. One of the most important aspects to recognize in the criteria is that the symptoms need to be present for at least 2 weeks straight, and they represent a change from previous functioning. Right, so that's a pretty significant amount of time, 2 weeks straight at least. And then when we say previous functioning, it means that there's definitely a change here. I will also point out that there are kind of different categories of symptoms here. You have the more overtly emotional ones, so things like feelings of sadness, feelings of worthlessness, and potentially, thoughts of death in some cases. And then you have ones that are maybe a little bit more on the physiological side, like the psychomotor changes, fatigue, weight fluctuation, and sleep changes. And what all that means is that depression can look pretty different from one person to another. For one person, they might be crying constantly and just feeling like they're a failure. Maybe they're avoiding social interactions, activities they used to do, and they just feel like the world may be better off without them. Whereas another person might not even be super aware of their feelings. They just might feel like everything is blank and blah. They're not even sad. They just don't feel much of anything. They don't want to do anything. And they're so lethargic that every day feels like torture to them, and they're just sleeping their days away. Either way, depression is more than just being blue. It's more than just having moments of sadness. We all have moments of sadness. We all have situations that suck and make us feel down in the dumps. That's not what we're talking about here. With major depression, we're talking about a persistent pattern of these symptoms that lasts over time and really interferes with your life. For most people with depression, they do tend to have recurrent episodes, meaning you'll have an episode, maybe, months or years down the line, it'll kind of come back and it ebbs and flows. But it is possible as well to have just a single isolated major depressive episode. But the length of that can vary pretty significantly. For some people, it's just a matter of months. For some people, it might be a whole year. And before I continue here, let me take a quick break and talk about our first sponsor. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. One of the aspects of my life that I'm really proud of is the way that I've made an effort to really show up in my relationships. Relationships aren't always easy, and sometimes they take work, not just with the other people involved, but with yourself. And over the past couple of years, I've done a lot of internal work to find ways to be empathetic and supportive in relationships, but also less codependent. And I think that I'm in a healthier place with my relationships than I ever have been. And of course, an amazing tool to work through the challenges that may arise in relationships, whether they be romantic, with family, or other kinds, is therapy. Therapy gives you somebody that has no skin in the game, no stakes there, to help you understand the dynamics that might be playing out in relationships and tools to improve them. So if you're thinking of giving therapy a try, check out BetterHelp. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. And of course, you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So visit betterhelp.com/Duff today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Duff. Okay, so jumping back into it, with all mental health disorders, it's understood that they are at that level of being considered a disorder when they interfere with functioning. For people with depression, it's common for symptoms to cause difficulty with work or school. For example, some people end up missing a lot of class and having poor grades because they can't motivate themselves to complete work or study. It can also cause social impairment in that you might pull away from other people, which is damaging to romantic relationships or friendships, even relationships with family. And in this way, it can really perpetuate this sort of self-reinforcing cycle where you pull away from people because you're depressed, and then you feel sad at being isolated, which then makes you more depressed. And it kind of, again, just perpetuates that cycle. So that in a nutshell is major depression. I also quickly want to point out the other disorder that I talked about, persistent depressive disorder. This is also commonly called dysthymia, which I'm going to call it because it's easier. But basically, this is depression that can be less intense than major depression, though not always, but it tends to last a long time. So technically speaking, the person who has dysthymia needs to be with significant depression symptoms for at least a 2-year period with no more than 2 months of relief at a time, right? So if you think about that, over the course of a year, you have to be basically depressed almost all the time with no more than just 2 months of relief at a time. So it's very persistent, which is why it's called persistent depressive disorder. And sometimes people think of this, think of dysthymia as a less severe form of depression, but that's really underplaying how much it can impact you, because even if the threshold for symptoms is lower, meaning you need, just a few criteria instead of all of those criteria, or 5 of them at least, you don't have as many symptoms, or maybe not as severe symptoms, but the fact that it just never lets up can be totally maddening. It can really mess with you and impact your life in the long run. So, even if you're not meeting that full criteria for, major depressive disorder, if you're in the realm of dysthymia, this persistent depressive disorder, you really still need to take it seriously because it can impact things for you. So getting back to, depression in general, let's look at a couple of case studies. I wrote out a couple of case studies of what this might look like. Okay. So first one we're going to talk about is James. James is a 30-year-old web developer, and he's been quietly struggling with depression for years. On the surface, he seems to be successful. He has a good job. He talks to his parents on the phone once a week, and generally he's engaged in conversations and meetings at work. However, under the surface, he battles feelings of emptiness and worthlessness. He doesn't feel like his life has any meaning, and he can't find motivation to do any activities outside of work that might bring him pleasure. When he's not working, he tends to drink alone while feeling disgusted with himself about, wasting his life. And while his work-related appearance seems fairly typical, James struggles with insomnia, and his apartment is extremely messy due to low motivation. If you were to ask James how he is, he'd probably just say, "I'm good, how are you?" But this is really just a daily mask that James puts on while thinking quiet thoughts about how meaningless his life is. So that's one version of what depression can look like. Think about it for a moment, what I just said, and see if you notice any of the criteria that we talked about. Definitely, I think that there's some hopelessness in there, right? There's a lack of interest in activities, sleep changes, interference in social activities, and we can infer from, talking to him or hearing about him, at least it's something that we would want to probe further about. Perhaps there's some suicidal ideation there. So that's one example. Let's talk about another case study to just show a different perspective. So let's talk about Ellie. Ellie is a 22-year-old college student. She struggled with symptoms of depression on and off throughout high school, but this was thought to be more of a reaction to the fact that her parents were going through a contentious divorce at that same time. Now, the transition to college was also difficult. She had trouble making friends, trouble being away from home for the first time, and this led to feelings of isolation and sadness. But unfortunately, these feelings didn't fade throughout her first semester of school, and now she's experiencing significant disruptions in her life. Unlike James, Ellie isn't able to push through and focus her attention into work, and she's actually getting C's and D's in most of her classes. When some of her professors have asked to meet with her because she's struggling, she's avoided these one-on-one meetings because she can barely look at somebody in the eye without bursting into tears. All of this makes her feel very, very guilty, as her parents are helping pay for her tuition, and she feels like she's wasting it. And when she's not in class, she tends to keep to herself in her dorm room with her headphones in, watching the same comfort shows on repeat. Rather than gaining the freshman 15 pounds that you might see in a lot of people, she's actually lost 20 pounds since coming to college, and she's constantly feeling fatigued. So routine activities like doing laundry have started to feel like torture for her. Although she's not close with her roommate, Jordan has asked Ellie if she's okay and if there's anything she can do to help, because it's so obvious that she's just not having a good time. So this highlights a different type of depression, which is, a little more overt. Ellie spends a lot of time crying, feeling sorrowful. She has a hard time masking, whereas James is able to hide behind his work. But no one of those is more important or more severe than the other. They're just different flavors of it. There are many different ways that depression can look. And so hopefully these examples illustrate some of that variety. Now, just need to throw this out there. Those case studies, these are not real people. These are not individuals. It's more of kind of an amalgamation based on various people that I've experienced and what I know. But I think they're pretty realistic pictures of what that could look like. So now that we've talked about, what depression is, let's talk about 5 common misconceptions that are related to depression. I already talked a bit about the first misconception, which is that depression isn't just feeling sad or feeling the blues. We also often don't diagnose major depressive disorder when you're just reacting to something devastating. If you lost your dog and your house in a fire with all of your other most prized possessions, we'd be more worried if you didn't show signs of depression, right? That's a normal reaction to these really intense circumstances. So, major depression isn't just feelings of sadness, but it's also not, a normal reaction to a really bad situation. The second misconception is that depression is a sign of weakness. Some people that are out there that you consider the strongest people you can think of have struggled with depression and you didn't even know it. Some estimates say that about 8% of adults in the United States, which is 21 million people, have had at least one major depressive episode in their life, right? And it can truly impact anybody, regardless of your background. Depression is a complex interaction between brain chemistry, genetics, environmental factors. It is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. The third misconception is that you can just snap yourself out of depression if you try hard enough. That's really dumb, right? Like if you think about it, just being able to will yourself out of depression probably means that you don't actually have depression, because lacking hope and motivation is often part of depression. So the disorder itself keeps you from pulling yourself out. This doesn't mean that depression can't resolve on its own, and it often does with time, but it commonly requires treatment. And we'll talk about that more in a bit, but it's not as simple as snapping your fingers and just going, okay, you know what? I'm done with this. No more depression. It'd be nice, but not how it works out. The fourth misconception is that you can't be depressed if you have a good life. And this is a tough one, right? Depression is not always a reaction to difficulties in life. You can absolutely have depression even if you're in a position of privilege. And in fact, shame about the fact that you have depression, even though you have it easy, it can be a compounding factor for some people because they may be less likely to seek help because they feel foolish or embarrassed. Like, what do I have to be depressed about? But that's not what it's about. It's not about how good your life is. It's a separate thing. The fifth and final misconception that I'll mention is the idea that talking about depression just makes it worse. Now, this is just straight up not true. Avoiding the issue doesn't make it go away. And in fact, talking about it openly is one of the best things that you can do. I always say that depression wants to hide itself. It wants to preserve itself. It wants to be your deep, dark secret and not let anybody else in. But when you take it out and just drag it out into the light and openly talk about it, it really helps to take away some of its power over you. Now, talking about depression and only depression and not talking about anything else in your life can certainly draw a lot of attention to it. And in some cases that can be detrimental, but the concept of talking about it doesn't make it worse. So if you can talk about it and take some action, that's going to be the best case. Now, before we continue, let's go ahead and take another quick break and talk about our second sponsor today. This episode is brought to you by Chomps. Every so often, I get a sponsor on the podcast that sends product over for me to try, and I'm left immediately wanting more. And that is Chomps for me. I've said it before, but Chomps, if you're listening, hook me up. One of my personal biggest vices is snacking. And I don't mean, a vice in the moral sense, but for me, my own personal health, this is the habit that gets me into the most trouble. But when I'm up late after everybody else has gone to bed and I'm still working, it's just really hard to pretend like there aren't all sorts of snacks and goodies that I could get into while I'm working on stuff. So for me, it's helpful to have alternatives, healthier things that I can eat that are still satisfying but aren't going to be as detrimental. And that's where Chomps comes in. Chomps, simply put, are meat sticks, but they aren't like the mystery meat that you find near the counter at the gas station. They have 0 sugar, up to 12 grams of protein, and they're made from high quality, sustainably sourced meat. Their ingredient lists are very small, which is a good thing, and you can see exactly what's in there. They come in 9 different varieties. I'm a fan of the taco flavor, the beef one, but they have all sorts of different types, including beef, turkey, and even venison, and they're all tasty. Right now, Chomps is offering you guys, the listeners, 20% off your first order and free shipping when you go to chomps.com/duff. So head over there to chomps.com/duff, see all the delicious flavors, and get 20% off your first order and free shipping. That's chomps.com/duff. Okay, so we've talked a bit about what depression is. We've talked about some case studies, some common misconceptions. Now let's talk about what can be done about depression. If you've been listening to this episode and it seems like either yourself or a loved one may actually have major depression, I have some good news for you. Depression is treatable. However, due to the nature of depression, many people don't get treatment for it. I'm not going to dive deep into the statistics and all of the clinical research right now, but I will say that they've done several large meta-analyses, meaning studies that group together a bunch of other studies with thousands of participants, and they've consistently found that both medication and therapy are effective in treating depression. The research also suggests that the combined approach is probably better than just medication alone. There's some question as to whether the combined approach is significantly better than just therapy, but if you can do both, that's great. I also want to mention that there are lifestyle changes that can be very helpful in reducing depression. For example, it's been shown in the research that consistent moderate exercise, especially cardiovascular exercise, can have a similar effect size to medication when it comes to reducing depression. And the awesome thing is you can do any or all of them. The way I often see it working out is that medication is sometimes required for people first. Not always, but sometimes. Because depression is very paradoxical. Like I mentioned earlier, the symptoms of depression make it hard for you to find the will to claw your way out of depression. So getting a boost from medication is often what's called for to help relieve you of some of those depression symptoms so that you can put in some of that work and make changes for yourself. To be clear, not everybody needs medication, but if you've been stuck in depressive symptoms and can't seem to benefit from other things that you're doing, it's definitely something to consider. There's nothing wrong with whatever you do regarding medication. If you decide to just jump straight to medication as a first line, that's okay. If you want to hold off and see what you can do without it for whatever reason, that's also okay. But I just want to tell you, it's not weak to take medication. I take medication. I am on, a low dose of an SSRI called Lexapro or escitalopram. I've been on it for quite some time now, and it makes a huge difference in my life, even if it's a low dose, and I'm really happy to continue taking it. So it's not a weak thing to do. But there are various types of medications that can help you with depression. I'm not going to dive into all of the specific types. There are lots of resources out there you can look at. But broadly speaking, for depression, most medications that you're going to take are ones that you take every day, and those help you to gradually change the balance of the neurotransmitters in your brain. Neurotransmitters I've talked about on the show before, but these are the chemical messengers in your brain, such as serotonin or dopamine. Now, unlike medications for anxiety, for depression, you don't typically have medications that are taken sort of on an as-needed basis for emergencies. For anxiety, you might have things like, say, Xanax, which is a sedative to help you when you're feeling panicky. It's not something you're supposed to take every day if you can avoid it, but when the need arises and you need that help in the moment, you have something you can rely on. With depression, we don't necessarily have the same thing, although depression and anxiety do often go together. But instead, mostly we have these medications that, you take it every day and it tries to relieve some of that burden and make you feel a bit lighter, a little bit better, a little less hopeless. Not every person reacts the same way to medication, and it can take some trial and error. People have side effects at times. There are various side effects for different medications. They can include things like dry mouth or headaches. They can include things like weight gain or, changes to sexual functioning. But it's not the same for everybody. And, there's no free lunch. You're always going to have some degree of side effects. But when you're doing the balancing act, a lot of people find that, the primary effect of the medication is well worth any of the minor side effects that they have. And when you're able to find a medication that works for you, it can really, really help to ease that crushing pressure of the depression. I like to think of it as, you're wearing a backpack with 100 pounds in it. And if you could even take out 50 of those pounds, life still isn't easy walking around with a 50-pound backpack, but it's a whole hell of a lot easier than a 100-pound one, right? And so if you can lift out some of those, those weights from your backpack, suddenly it frees you up to put more effort forward, to be able to actually even care about feeling better, or think that you're going to be able to benefit from things like therapy or other lifestyle changes. So, sometimes it's a combination approach because you need to take that first layer off so that you can do anything about it. Now, speaking of therapy, there are many types of therapy that are helpful. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is one of the most commonly studied, and it is very effective for depression. But please know, CBT is not everyone's cup of tea, and there are plenty of other research-supported approaches. If you're looking for a hands-on approach that digs into your thinking patterns and gives you practical coping tools, CBT may be great for you. If you find that your depression stems more from relational patterns, maybe something like psychodynamic therapy or internal family systems might be a better fit. There are also people who are more solution-focused and immediate versus those who are more oriented toward looking for insight, talking about your history and your past. Even just supportive therapy, being very humanistic and hearing what someone has to say and being empathetic toward them can be very helpful for depression. So don't get too hung up on the specific approach as long as it's not something that's wackadoodle and not actually a supported therapeutic approach, there's a lot of things that can help with depression, and everybody has a certain approach that they tend to benefit more from. Both medication and therapy are often covered by insurance, so be sure to look there first so you don't end up paying an arm and a leg when you don't have to, especially for medication, right? If you're seeing a psychiatrist and paying out of pocket for, medication management, you might have very short appointments and, sort of have quick check-ins and then realize you're paying $250, $300. I heard today from somebody that lives near me that I was giving some feedback to, $400 a session, which is like, damn, right? I can't pay $400 a session for psychiatry. So be sure to check in with your insurance. There are various options. And for the depression medication, a lot of times your primary care doctor can also start with those. If it becomes more complicated and it needs a little bit more nuance, definitely I'd say a psychiatrist, meaning a specialist, is called for. But if you're like me and what you're looking for is just a little bit of help with a low dose of a SSRI, like a basic medication, there's no reason you can't do that through primary care if you have a primary care that you trust. But in addition to therapy, in addition to medications, there are also so many awesome self-help resources out there that can make a big difference. One thing I would suggest to you guys is finding online communities. If you go to Facebook and search Hardcore Self-Help, we have a private Facebook group that you can ask to join. And that's a great resource if you're trying to look for, say, a book or, an area online where you can find support groups or anything like that, just throwing it out there and seeing what other people have found. But yeah, not to toot my own horn, I also wrote an awesome and comprehensive book about depression. It's called Hardcore Self-Help, Fuck Depression. It's my second book that I wrote. And, I think honestly that book doesn't quite get the recognition it deserves. My anxiety book is a lot more popular, and it's for good reason. The anxiety book was like hard out of the gate. It's short. It's very digestible. A lot of people find it very, actionable for that reason. The depression book isn't long, but it's a bit longer, but it's also, in my opinion, a lot better, and it's a little bit more mature, and it balances, my characteristic approach with also some really solid information. And it goes through all the tools and information that you need to do a lot of the work that you would actually do in therapy on your own. But there are also amazing YouTube videos out there, online courses, apps, books, other podcasts. I would say it's important to just, try to triangulate your information and vet your sources. Anybody can put out a video, anybody can put out a TikTok, anybody can put out an online course and say that they're a coach in something. Doesn't mean they know what the hell they're talking about, right? But sometimes you just need to hear the information that maybe you even already know in a voice that resonates with you, just to knock something loose and start making a difference for yourself. So there's a lot of opportunities for that out there online. And there are a lot of amazing clinicians out there, lots of therapists, lots of psychiatrists and doctors, people that are putting out good information that's clinically sound. So definitely have a look if you're looking for that type of resource. I also want to take a moment, since we're talking about doctors, to mention you should always talk to your doctor when you're considering whether you may have depression, because there are other physical health issues that can cause similar symptoms. For example, hormonal issues, things like low testosterone, a poor diet, or even a diet that just doesn't jive with you for whatever reason. Maybe you have an allergy you didn't know about or some sort of sensitivity. Those things can definitely cause behavioral changes. Vitamin deficiencies, that's a big one. People may not realize that they're deficient in a certain type of vitamin, and that's causing changes. And a very common one that I've talked about before is hypothyroidism. If you're low in your thyroid hormone, that can cause symptoms that very similarly mimic depression. So, it's important to at least do the legwork, get some lab work done, make sure there's not an obvious answer to what's going on with you before diving into the possibility that you might have major depressive disorder. Now, let's say that you've tried everything under the sun to treat your depression, but nothing seems to work. You've tried medication, therapy, support groups, all of it. There are other options as well. This is what we might refer to as treatment-resistant depression, meaning depression that doesn't respond to medication very well, that doesn't really shake even though you're trying other approaches. And there are also other options for that. I've done different episodes on these approaches. So there's episode 346. You would just do duffthepsych.com/episode 346. In that episode, I compare and contrast two common treatments, which are ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Sounds scarier than it is. Go listen to the episode. I compare and contrast ECT with ketamine infusions. And then way back in episode 107, I do kind of a comprehensive breakdown of all the different treatment options, including ECT, including TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation, ketamine therapy. In the future, I'm sure we will be much more able to include psychedelic assisted therapy to the list, because that's a huge area of research right now that shows a lot of promise. But yeah, there are approaches that can help you if nothing else helps as well. So I hope that all of this gives you a good overview of depression and a place to start if you feel like you may be experiencing it. Please reach out if you think that you might be struggling with depression. Even if you have a lot of information about the disorder, you really can't diagnose yourself, and it's important to establish care with a qualified provider to help you navigate it. Even if that's just starting with your primary care, that's okay. You are the expert on yourself, but you don't have to figure it out all on your own. In a lot of cases, you can't. So try to get some help. And if you'd like to learn more about topics related to coping with depression, specific skills, or topics like supporting a partner with depression, be sure to head over to my website, duffthepsych.com, and use the search bar. Look for relevant topics. You can just type in partner, or you can type in depression. I put out a lot of episodes in the course of this podcast that are related to it. And even if you're not personally impacted by depression, a lot of the tips and tricks are going to be great for anybody to improve their life. And it may come in handy if you happen to have a loved one that finds themselves in the throes of depression at some point in their life. So that's the episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to find the show notes for this, go to duffthepsych.com/episode 384, and please take really good care of yourselves. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode. If you would like to send a question or a topic for a future episode, please email me at duffthepsych@gmail.com. If you like my approach and would like to learn more about my books, online course, or other resources, please head over to my website at duffthepsych.com. And lastly, it would mean so much to me if you would leave a review for the podcast wherever you listen to it, or share an episode with a friend. Until next time, you got this.